I think there's an old joke that if the speedometer isn't working, you don't know whether to accelerate or to brake. And I think in COVID times, it's really important for all of us to agree on what speedometer to look at. Year-on-year growth rates at the best of times are deceptive because they talk about the accumulation over 4 quarters. So more and more countries are just moving to a quarterly momentum path. What is the quarter-on-quarter annualized growth rate? Are we growing at 5% or 6% or 7%? And I think more and more, given repeated waves, to get an understanding of the economy, we should start focusing on the sequential momentum of growth. That tells us what speed we're driving at the moment, which is important. The second point, as you alluded to, is levels. We need to know how far to go and how far we are from our destination. And so I keep going back to the pre-pandemic path. Let's assume the economy is going to go at 6 or 6.5% absent the pandemic. So we can map out a level of GDP every quarter and keep asking ourselves, how far are we from that pre-pandemic path? Because ultimately, that's what matters for job creation, as we'll discuss later. So I think what the advanced estimates tell us is, in the last quarter, we were back at the pre-pandemic level. We were 100 in March of 2020. In September, we're back at 100. And to be fair, October, November, December, we're still growing at 3 or 4%. I would argue it's not as buoyant and strong as some people made out to be in the month of October. If you look at a monthly frequency, you'll see October was very strong, but November gave back a lot of those gains, suggesting that October was much more kind of pent-up, festival, concentrated demand. But despite that, I think October, November, December will still see a 3 to 4% sequential increase in levels. January to March has become much more uncertain because of Omicron. But if you just stick by the advanced estimate, and if we grow at 9.2%, I would argue there's some downside risk to that. We'll still be about 6% below the pre-pandemic path. And we have to ask ourselves that every 2 quarters. A year from now, is that gap from 6% getting lower? How much lower? How quickly will we asymptote towards that path? One final point I'll make just in terms of year-on-year growth rates for FY23. Because of these large potholes and the worries that I spoke about, the year-on-year growth rate for next year will offer more noise than signal. And here's a simple example. The consensus estimate for FY23 is about 7.6% on the back of a 9% growth this year. Well, that's essentially only corresponds to a 4% annualized growth momentum through the year. So if the economy grows at 4% through the year, we still have a 7.6% number, right? To have 7% growth through the year, that full year number needs to print at 9.3 or 9.4. So again, what I would urge and plead everyone to do is abandon year-on-year growth rates. Let's focus on sequential momentum. Let's focus on distance from the pre-pandemic path.
Beyond the headline, so I think we've all sort of focused on the consumption side. It's important to try and understand how that is playing out. You also, in your note, then go on to look at consumption of goods versus services.
Yes.
Can you help us understand why you see that as important?
That's just a qualitative barometer to help us whether we're just coming back to pre-pandemic levels or how we're growing beyond that. Because if you look at the differential speeds, goods were back, and I'm using IP as the broad barometer of goods, we're back at pre-pandemic levels in March or April, right? And services have taken much longer to get back. Now, the question is, if the growth in the last few months or the next few months is driven by goods who've already reached the 100 level, that's really encouraging because that tells you there's life beyond the pre-pandemic level. If it's driven largely by services reopening and getting back to 100, then there are limits to that process. And any upsurge will be contained. So I think the second kind of qualitative metric to keep asking every month or every quarter is this acceleration or is the momentum being driven by goods or by services? Thus far, unfortunately, IP seems to have got stuck around the 100, 101 mark for the last few months, suggesting there's a plateauing out there. And much of the momentum that we've seen in the last few months is services. Again, I think the IP number that comes out this week, I think there's an expectation here that month on month that may contract again. So we've got to be mindful of what's driving growth because that would be a good way to prognosticate the future.